absolutely. So my name is Kendall Bouquet, and I work at Migrant Centre NI. And Migrant Centre NI works across Northern Ireland to support migrant and ethnic minority communities here through direct service provision in the form of immigration advice, hate crime victim support, financial health and benefits advice, and kind of just other programming as we kind of get funding for it, really. And we would also do policy and kind of advocacy and lobbying work that is informed by our service provision, so that we can apply the work that we're doing with the clients we serve to kind of policy and advocacy work. So we are in a situation where, because we are service providers, we use international law to highlight the obligations under international law for the government to adequately resource, for the UK to adequately resource organizations that support victims of gender-based violence. And so obviously Northern Ireland is a very kind of specific context where local organizations that support victims of gender-based violence, that support kind of women and girls, and would be needing to kind of do their policy and their advocacy work not only at the national level, but also at the devolved level. And so really, when using international level using international law at the local level, we find that we need to make the case to, for example, the Northern Ireland Executive, that even though it is devolved, that they need to mirror the commitments made by the United Kingdom under international law when developing kind of local legislation. So a big example for this would be the fact that Northern Ireland doesn't have a women and girls strategy. So that would be kind of this devolved issue that we're lobbying on, and saying that you need to be in step with the rest of the United Kingdom under international law. On the Women's Policy Group for Northern Ireland, and we would also sit on the co-design group for the Gender Equality Strategy. So we would use international law in kind of those contexts to advocate for justice in instances of gender-based violence through adequate resourcing. So the kind of three pieces of international law that I think we kind of use most frequently would be, one of which would be the Istanbul Convention, but also the ways that issues facing migrant and ethnic minority communities interface and are inextricable from issues like gender-based violence. And so, again, as a service provider, we would really be pushing for the commitment to provide adequate resourcing. And so the Istanbul Convention, which is kind of aimed at preventing and combating violence against women and kind of domestic violence, gender-based violence, would require states who are party to it to allocate appropriate financial and human resources for the adequate implementation of policies, measures, and programs to prevent and combat all forms of gender-based violence. So under that, for example, we, in responding to consultations and in the evidence that we gave in the Domestic Abuse and Family Proceedings Bill, would argue that Northern Ireland would be, and the Northern Ireland Executive, in order to be in keeping with international law under the Istanbul Convention, would have to address the need for resourcing for organizations that support victims of gender-based violence, because without the resourcing, you can have the best legislation in the world, and it's still not going to help victims ultimately. And so that would be kind of particular importance in our case, because while there are women's sector organizations that do amazing work in terms of providing refuge and services to victims of gender-based violence, and obviously would provide that to anybody who kind of comes through the door, they're unlike in England, Scotland, and Wales, there are no specialist services currently for ethnic minority or migrant victims of gender-based violence. And so it's kind of a twofold issue in terms of the resourcing that we can point to as being non-compliant with international law, in terms of lack of resourcing on the part of the government, in that there are no specialist resources, and the resources that do exist for victims of gender-based violence are not adequately resourced to deal with the additional needs that migrant women might bring, whether that be the resourcing to have interpreters, or to kind of have that extra level of support in women's refuges, for example. And in addition, with the Istanbul Convention, I think that it is really useful for us to point to in doing policy work as an organization that works with migrants, because of things like Article 59, which points to, which kind of talks specifically about resident status. And so what we, for example, gave evidence on in the domestic abuse proceedings legislation was the way that immigration status is used as part of, is used against victims of gender-based violence as a pattern of coercive control, and that resident status can actually be tied into that. So being able to point to the Istanbul Convention, which basically aims to, basically requires state parties to mitigate punishment or kind of consequences for victims with regard to their immigration status for coming forward in reporting abuse, is really useful for us. And so that would be lobbying on the national level, kind of as a reserved issue. On the one hand, in that we can say, you know, the domestic violence disclosure scheme is far from perfect, and there are a lot of women who or a lot of victims who would kind of fall through the cracks on that, particularly those with kind of insecure status, or those who with no recourse to public funds. But then also on the devolved level, it's that extra level of lobbying, of saying, yes, while this may be a reserved issue, it is the NI executive's responsibility to mitigate the effects of these policies, and we're able to kind of point to international law just to make a more substantial argument in doing that. And then also the Istanbul Convention would make specific reference to gender-based asylum claims as well. And then I just think it does a really comprehensive job of talking about resourcing. So for example, including in policy that we would do is the need for awareness raising and education, training of professionals who kind of work with victims of gender-based violence. And from our perspective, it is like an extra need for education, awareness raising, and training on not only gender-based violence, but the ways that it particularly affects migrants and kind of people from ethnic minority backgrounds. And in addition, it requires or obligates state parties to provide, to have adequate resourcing for legal aid, which again is one of those things that in theory we do have in Northern Ireland, but in practice, isn't always as kind of smooth as you would like. And then also it talks about the need for preventative kind of intervention and treatment in terms of resourcing. And so we would point to, as well as the need to have specialist services for ethnic minority and migrant victims of gender-based violence. UN Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women. And that would also be kind of backing up the issue on resourcing, because it requires state parties to include in government budgets adequate resources for their activities related to the elimination of violence against women. And so, yeah, that would be both on the national and the devolved level that we would be kind of using that in any kind of policy work that we would be doing and lobbying that we would be doing. And then finally, another piece that we would be using quite a lot is CEDAW, so the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. CEDAW is really useful because CEDAW and the Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women are both really useful because they are gender specific to the ways that violence does affect women and girls in particular ways, and affects them kind of disproportionately, certain in instances of domestic violence. So in Northern Ireland, where we don't have a women and girls strategy, it's helpful to be able to point to precedent in international law where they are making it very gender specific. So that, for example, one, that we would need a women and girls strategy, and then on legislation that is rightfully, needs to apply to all victims and should be gender neutral in its application, like the domestic abuse legislation, like the Domestic Abuse Protective Orders bill would apply obviously to all victims, and rightly so, but we would advocate that there needs to be informed kind of consideration and reference to mitigating the particular effects on women and girls that this legislation and the issues that it's seeking to address. I also think that CEDAW is really helpful for us because I think when working in policy, you want to be able to get quite specific when you need to. So for example, I think CEDAW is really useful because it brings reference to rural women. And so, like, for example, in our context, working with the migrant population here, not only would Northern Ireland have, quite a big rural population to begin with, but also you would have kind of pockets of the country where the agri-food sector is being disproportionately, or you would have to kind of disproportionate numbers of migrants working in the agri-food sector in certain parts of the country. And so in instances like that, for example, you might have a woman who's experiencing domestic violence, and the issues facing her are that she is experiencing gender-based violence, that she is a migrant or the spouse of a migrant worker, and that she is actually rural as well. And so in these instances, which we've seen quite a number of times, that's a number of kind of intersecting factors that would be preventing maybe access to resources that would be able to best kind of help her in that situation. And so CEDAW would point to issues facing rural women specifically, and the requirement to take those into consideration. And also, I think in terms of advocacy that we would do around gender-based violence and migrant women, CEDAW requires that to be in keeping with it, women are able to participate in all aspects of cultural life. And so Jewish Women's Aid in kind of based over in England has done really amazing work bringing to the forefront this idea of like spiritual abuse, where actually women are kind of have their faith and the power of the faith community kind of leveraged against them in keeping with coercive control. So as to say something like, if you leave this relationship, you're breaking religious law. And so actually, in addition to the kind of financial, emotional, psychological, physical, sexual aspects that domestic abuse can take on, there can be spiritual abuse as well. And so this would actually preclude victims of domestic abuse from it alienates them from their faith and from their community, really, in a very insidious way. And so some of the women in ethnic minority women in Northern Ireland that are kind of based in faith communities, who would also be advocates for gender justice, are pointing to this issue of spiritual abuse. And I think that being able to point to under CEDAW, the requirement for women to be able to participate in all aspects of cultural life would include their faith, and would include just not being alienated from their community if it kind of is like an ethnic minority community within Northern Ireland. And then the like in kind of situating, I think something that we would advocate for at the UK level, that would be an issue that affects migrants generally, but also has kind of gender specific implications. You can point to things like the European Convention on Human Rights, as far as putting things, if you want to think about things like healthcare as a right, for example, under the Immigration Acts of 2014 and 2016, which led to the current kind of hostile environment policies as codified, with this kind of everyday policing of immigration status by landlords and universities and employers, and kind of notably through the NHS. What we have seen, and what the British Medical Association has reported, is that immigration reporting through the NHS has a deterrent effect on migrants from receiving healthcare, and that there are gender-specific lenses that can be applied to this, as in, for example, things like ovarian cancer screenings, breast cancer screenings, and any kind of preventative healthcare for migrant communities they are deterred from accessing. Very specifically, with a gendered lens, would be the fact that certain services under the NHS are chargeable for people with no recourse to public funds, and notably maternity services are chargeable under the NHS, And so being able to point to things like the European Convention on Human Rights and kind of broader international law that wouldn't be gender specific, that would point to the right to health. We would argue that, like, even though there are there are gendered lenses you can apply, but if you zoom out and just look at it a bit broader as well, like that this would be in contravention of international standards in terms of people having equal access to healthcare, when we know that that's not the case because of the UK's hostile environment policies. And that under the Immigration Acts of 2014 and 2016, there have been thousands upon thousands of requests for immigration reporting data from the NHS on the part of the Home Office, which have turned up information which leads to deportations, essentially. So this is extremely in contravention to the right to health.